This is episode 483 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Phillip K. Howard. He is a lawyer, author, and civic leader. He is chair of Common Good, a nonpartisan organization aimed at simplifying government. He grew up in Kentucky and lives in New York City, and we are going to be talking about his most recent book, Not Accountable: Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. And I'm holding up a copy right now if you are watching on video. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Phillip.
Great to be with you, Paul.
Yeah, so we've actually talked once before, and it's been a while. It was about your last book, and it's been a few years, though. So why don't you refresh folks' memories? Who are you, and what do you, how
when
do you...
did I get out of jail?
How did you get involved in this? Yeah.
I'm complying with the parole conditions, all that. As I said, I grew up in Kentucky. My big break in life when I was a gopher as a teenager to a Nobel Prize winner at the Oak Ridge National Lab doing economics research. There's nothing like hanging around the smartest people in the world to educate you about how things work. I was a lawyer in New York, very active in civic affairs, and through the 1980s, I kept asking why my friends in government couldn't do what they thought made sense. I mean, they had big jobs in government, running agencies or whatever. And so I just started looking into it, and it ended up being a book called The Death of Common Sense, which was a big bestseller, of which the basic idea is if you try to tell people exactly how to do things in 1,000-page rule books and such, you make them fail. It turns into a bad version of central planning. Everybody goes through the day with their noses in the rule books and instead of looking where they need to go. So since then, I've advised, I think, every president or every presidential administration, one way or another. I haven't accomplished very much, I would say, but a few things. The infrastructure permitting in the last few years was based on some things that Common Good had recommended. So we've had a few accomplishments over the years, but by and large, we still have a kind of a legacy bureaucratic structure that really causes everything to fail. Schools, you name it.
Yeah, now that you mention it, that is what we talked about before, is infrastructure and permitting and the challenges of kind of building anything, and something that I definitely found very fascinating, because we always are hearing here in New Mexico, across the country, about and seeing the infrastructure issues that our country and our state faces, and no matter how much money is poured into it, it doesn't seem to improve. Now, it seems to me that infrastructure and public employee unions are connected in a certain way, but maybe not directly, but maybe to an extent. But your issue is the constitutionality of those public employee unions, and there's a history involved here that I know you go into in the book, and I was familiar with some of it, but not all of it. But let's talk about that history as we work our way into the topic. And specifically, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he wasn't a fan of public employee unions. Most, certainly liberals, are shocked to hear that, but he really pushed back against the notion of government employees unionizing. So let's get to that history.
Right. So there's a difference in kind between trade unions, say the auto workers, for example, and public unions that FDR and other leaders until the 1960s well understood. The difference is not only the absence of market constraints. So in the trade union context, if the union demands too much, the company will move out of town and everyone will lose their job or they'll go out of business. So government can't move out of town, right? But there's also an ethical difference, which FDR emphasized. Public employees have a duty to serve the public, not negotiate against it. So it's sort of a different type of issue, and also the origin story is different. Government's always been a somewhat sleepy employer, whereas back 120 years ago, corporate employers were, factories were dangerous, and unions were needed for things like basic safety and work conditions. That was never the case, and that was never the case in public unions. But the worst difference, the worst thing about public unions is that the dynamic of negotiating isn't to divide the profits between capital or labor. It's to get a friendly politician elected and then have him give whatever you can get away with. So public bargaining is almost unavoidably collusive. And the unions like to say, we elect our own bosses. So they get someone elected by millions of dollars, often, of campaign contributions, busloads of union members, staffing the phone banks, and that sort of thing. And then they come to the bargaining table and they sit on the same side of the table. It's not a negotiation, it's a payoff. And the result of all these 50, and by the way, this only happened 50 years ago. It only happened in the 1960s. So FDR's view prevailed until the 1960s and the rights revolution. Everybody just thought, well, giving people more rights is a good idea. So they finally gave the union leaders what they wanted. And since then, what we've had is more and more controls imposed by public unions that have effectively disempowered elected executives. So the main theme of the book is that voters elect governors and mayors who no longer have the authority to fix a lousy school, transform the culture of a toxic police force, or deliver basic services efficiently, trash collection and the like. And so we've got government cost twice what it should and fails while doing it.
Yeah, and so as you allude to, but don't directly speak about, it's kind of surprising the way public employees across the country became able to unionize in the first place. As you mentioned, they weren't during the Roosevelt years, Truman years, and Eisenhower, etc. It wasn't until John F. Kennedy, who these days you talk to a lot of conservatives, Republican types, and who's their favorite Democrat president of modern history. And frequently you get John F. Kennedy because he was so different from a lot of the more left-wing Democrats in many ways. But Kennedy did this. He allowed government employees to unionize, and he did so not even through Congress and legislative activity. He just signed an executive order, which he used that Obama, not invention, but the tool of the pen and the phone to allow that to happen. And that's a wild history. So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So civil service was created back in the 1880s to replace the spoils system. And it wasn't a system of tenure. It was a system of neutral hiring. Instead of giving people jobs because they worked on the campaign, people got jobs based on merit by test scores and that sort of thing. And then they would keep their jobs based on merit. That's how it worked. But getting rid of the spoils system had an unintended consequence of creating a huge voting block of permanent public employees. people, if they did their job, would expect to have a job for life. So as government grew, the number of employees grew, and that naturally created a kind of voting bloc. And by the time of the late fifth, by the time JFK was running for president, you had a huge number of public employees, even bigger today. There are 22 million people that work for government today in this country. It's like 16 or 17% of the total workforce. So they had organized into, they called them unions, but they didn't have real power. They were like any other kind of interest group and such. But they were able to amass huge numbers of votes. They helped JFK get elected, and that was a very tight election, as you'll recall. So as payback, JFK gave federal workers, by executive order, which are the smallest group, it's about 2 million today of the total public employment is federal. He gave federal workers collective bargaining rights. And it was all, there was a report by Arthur Goldberg that supposedly justified, he said, this will make government work better. Well, no one actually believed that. It was just a political payback.
So it is your perspective that Kennedy did this for blatantly political reasons to support his electoral efforts?
Sure, there's no other reason for him to do it. I mean, there was no need to give public workers collective bargaining rights. They already had civil service protection. This was the opposite of what happened in the progressive era with the union, unionizing industrial workers and such. So it was just a payback. And then a few years went by, and the rights revolution, was in full swing, and that was a very tumultuous decade. And toward the end of it, the same associations of public employees kept pressuring to get collective bargaining rights as just a matter of fairness. Why can't we be treated like trade unions? And people didn't think it through. And in New York, they allowed it in 1967. And within 2 years, 20 states had allowed collective bargaining. And today, there are 38 states out of the 50 that allow collective bargaining.
Wow. Well, as somebody who does like a lot of aspects of Kennedy and his legacy, this is certainly a huge black mark in terms of my judgment of him as a president. So I'll cite that as one notable outcome of my reading your book, because it really highlights Kennedy's role. I was aware, because I do, kind of study this for a living. I was aware that Kennedy had signed the executive order, but I really didn't understand or hadn't read about the political calculations that went into all that, and what that really entailed. So, okay, so
and people, just to be clear, people didn't understand that what they were bargaining over would be completely different than what industrial unions bargain over. Again, industrial unions are bargaining over who gets what share of the profits. In the public sector, there are no profits. And there's only so much people can get away with getting paid as salary, and they were already doing pretty well, even in 1962. So what they negotiate for is either really abusive pension and overtime schemes that are opaque so the voters can't see them, and mainly controls. So after 50 years, what you have are these, in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, multi-hundred-page collective bargaining agreements that prevent public supervisors from making any kind of decision without union approval. There's a pandemic. Sorry, the contract doesn't say anything about teaching in a pandemic. Sorry, the contract doesn't say anything about distance teaching. So that all has to be negotiated.
Yeah, fundamentally, something you said earlier, though, really, to me, gets to the heart of the matter, is that, businesses come and go, and if they negotiate a bad contract or two, they face hostile unions with bad work rules, that could eventually put that employer out of business. They face the discipline of the market. And just a modern example is FedEx and UPS. Both of them are unionized to an extent, but UPS is much more heavily unionized than FedEx. And UPS union and workers have to know that if they overdo it, if they let their company become uncompetitive with others in the marketplace, that they could face serious problems. That is not the case in government.
No, government can't go out of business. It's just the taxpayers pay. So you have these people negotiating who have a kind of back scratching operation. The unions get politician elected, and the politician gives the union all these controls, and the taxpayers who are not at the table end up footing the bill.
So what's the upshot here for government? Let's take this into the modern time. How do government employee unions impact government? And can you quickly kind of describe the various arrangements? There are states that have no public employee unions. There are states that have them but are right to work. Then there are states like New Mexico which are not right to work, and whether that matters because of the Janus decision. Kind of just states act very differently when it comes to public when it comes to unionization, even though Janus made a big difference.
Right. The states work somewhat differently, and the authorizations vary somewhat state to state. But even with states that don't have collective bargaining has enabled the national unions to amass such a huge political war chest, $5 billion in dues annually. We're talking about a lot of money now, that they influence the policies in states that don't have collective bargaining. And many of those states have, quote, meet and confer laws. So you sort of have to get along with the union, or the union's going to show up with busloads of people and get you unelected, even where there's no collective bargaining. So at this point, the political power of the unions has kind of taken a life of its own. And I talk about that in the book, and really the brutal political force that the national unions exercise. I mean, they'll put millions of dollars into a local legislative race if they think the person might be trying to do some modest reform of the union prerogative. So, and Janus, which was the great decision, which held that non-union members can't be forced to pay agency fees, has really only had a modest effect. And the unions have figured out ways to counteract it in a variety of ways. And that's why I think that ultimately the solution here is to call a spade and look at how the unions have undermined constitutional governance. We can't. Why is it that lousy schools almost never get fixed, and that we have the toxic police cultures? Why do they never get fixed? Why is it that public services cost, like trash collection in big cities, cost twice what private carters would charge? Why is it? Because no one who gets elected can change the way they operate because of the unions.
Well, that's certainly something that I would agree with wholeheartedly, and something that presents a challenge. So let's unpack that a little bit, though. When I tend to talk about public employee unions, I say some of those things as well, about how it degrades the services provided by government. You keep teachers who aren't very good on staff because of work rules, et cetera. So what are some of the things that people would notice when you have government unions in their very powerful position in government, and how did they get that position?
Well, what these agreements do, and the agreements, by the way, are not coterminous with electoral cycles. So if you get elected as a mayor or governor, you're bound by an agreement. So you can't run anything. The agreements eviscerate the key tools of management. So just starting at the top, accountability. Democracy is a process of accountability. That's what it is. We elect somebody. If they do a lousy job, we elect someone else or a different party, right? That's what democracy is. It's the voters elect people, give them supposedly the authority to run government well. And if they don't, we elect someone new. But that only works if the person elected has, as Madison put it, an unbroken chain of dependence from the lowest level, the middle level, to the highest, to the elected official. Accountability has to move down the line. There is zero accountability, near zero, in American government at any level. 99% of federal employees get a fully successful rating. The termination rate in most state school systems is between 0.01 and 0.02%. So in Illinois, for example, over an 18-year period, there was a total of 2 out of 95,000 teachers were dismissed, generally for poor performance. In California, it's even lower. Police is generally about 0.01 to 0.02%. Again, almost no one. In Minneapolis, the city, where the cop killed George Floyd and caused national riots and such. In the decade prior to Floyd's killing, the Minneapolis Police Department had received, I think, 12,000 complaints, 42,000 complaints, of which 12 resulted in discipline, and the most severe discipline was a 40-hour suspension. So in a governing system based on accountability, we have a system of government in America because of the unions where there's basically zero accountability. That's for starters. The second thing is that we elect executives to manage government, right? So what are the management tools? You go to the office, you decide who's doing the job, who isn't. Something unexpected comes up, you have to redeploy resources. Hey, can you help out over here? I think I would do this a different way. Whatever it happens to be, that's what managers do. In American government, you can't do that. You can't redeploy resources. If the repair crew is fixing something and there's an overhanging branch, they can't cut the branch because the work rules say that has to be a different category of worker. So a whole new work crew comes in to do that. I mean, so you end up with a government that's basically designed to be inefficient. It's designed to waste the money of taxpayers.
Yeah, well, I concur with that 100%. So you bring up, and the subtitle on your book says Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. How would the Constitution come into play in this debate, and how do you think we should use the Constitution to try to reconsider the status of public employee unions in this country?
Well, first, it's really important to understand why it's so hard, almost impossible, to solve this problem politically, because the public unions have organized the mass of government against the reform of government. So anybody who wants to reform this will have really a limitless pot of opposition that will get them unelected. And there are numerous examples I go through in the book of how the unions have done that. But in all the kind of complaining about public unions, people have assumed, well, they're just like trade unions. They have a right to do that. And they're inefficient, but what do? It's as if the public unions are a state of nature. They're not a state of nature. They're authorized by state statutes that allow them to do collective bargaining and allow them to do all these things that have had the effect of undermining constitutional governance. So in Not Accountable, what I do is I have a 5-point indictment, but basically explain why they've undermined the constitutional government that we're supposed to have, and why that should be unconstitutional under the United States Constitution. And I think that's the way to solve the problem.
So, what like does this involve litigation then?
Sure.
I suppose so.
Sure.
So talk about how that would work. Further litigation beyond Janus. Certainly, Janus. It worked as far as it went, and obviously hasn't solved this problem, because your book is here in 2023, and that case happened, what, 5 years ago?
5 years ago.
So,
well, but that was a First Amendment case. That was not a case questioning the very existence of public employee union. It was a case simply saying that public employees have a First Amendment right not to have to fund their activities, and that was fine. But if you read the Janus opinion, most of it is not about the First Amendment issue. Most of it is about how public unions have made government ungovernable. So why are they talking about it? It's as if the Supreme Court was searching for a theory. So there is a basic principle, a core first principle of constitutional governance, that no one elected can delegate their governing power to a private party. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. So if you're elected, you can't say to your friend or somebody who gave you some money, and to have now, or helped you get something, oh, okay, we'll let you exercise these governing powers. Because the power of governing is a trust given by the people to a designated official, and they're not allowed to give that up. This basic principle that comes out of John Locke's second treatise is reflected in several places in the Constitution, but as relevant to state and local government, it is reflected in Article 4 in something called the Guarantee Clause, which says, the United States shall guarantee to every state a republican form of government. And what that means, and James Madison talked about it a lot in the constitutional debates, what that means is that no matter what kind of government a state creates, the people who are elected to make governing decisions must be accountable to the voters. In other words, as Madison put it, you couldn't give any governing authority to nobles or to any, quote, favored class of people, that the official has to keep it so that the voters have a direct line to the people making decisions. Well, that's exactly what public unions have violated. The voters no longer have a direct line to the people making decisions because the unions have a veto over everything. So I argue that collective bargaining powers and other controls by unions violate the Guarantee Clause. Now, there's a little leap, a constitutional leap, that has to be made in this case, which I talk about in the book, which is that the Supreme Court's only addressed the Guarantee Clause a couple of times. And in each case, they've held that the courts shouldn't resolve it because the cases involve political issues, like, for example, which of two competing Rhode Island constitutions were more Republican. And indeed, that's a kind of issue that should be decided by the voters or by legislators. But the issues with public unions are not partisan issues. They're issues of governing authority. Who has the constitutional authority to run a school system or fire a bad cop? That's not a partisan issue. That's a matter of constitutional structure. And we elect people to make those decisions, and they no longer have that authority. So I think to me, it's pretty obvious that the case can be brought probably by a governor or mayor, although maybe by senior officials, because they all have the constitutional responsibility to run government. And the case can be brought and go up to the Supreme Court.
Well, I certainly hope for all of our sakes that that is correct and that happens. I hate to break this to you, and I know that you know this, even though you just said it's not a partisan issue. But Republicans, by and large, there are some notable exceptions on both sides of the aisle, but Republicans, by and large, are skeptical of public employee unions and what they do and how they operate, partially because when it comes to campaign contributions, looking at most of the big unions, the teacher unions, et cetera, something on the order of 95 to 99 to 99.9% of their campaign contributions go to one party, and it's the Democrats. So it is a partisan issue. What does that...
Wait, hold on a second. I talk about this in the book. Yes, the Democrats are completely in the pocket of the public union. Almost all the union support goes to the Democrats. So we understand that. But the issue presented to the court is who has authority to run a police force. That will be the same whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And if you gave Democratic officials a truth serum, they would all say that the unions prevent them from doing their jobs. So the legal issue does not involve a partisan issue. Yes, the unions themselves are partisan, but the legal issue of constitutional authority is neutral. It's only about one of constitutional authority.
Okay. Well, one of the things that in the Janus decision, the people bringing that suit felt pretty confident about was because some of the justices had made kind of comments and talked about how they would like to see that case looked at, again, the issue of inability to have right to work for government employees and members of unions in the public sector. Do you have any idea how the current court would consider a constitutional approach to public sector unions? Do you see a path to victory with the Supreme Court? Because I'm sure that any legal challenge would require a trip to the U.S. Supreme Court, I would imagine.
Well, in the case of Janus, the Supreme Court had actually had several First Amendment cases before then, the Knox case and a few others, where they had signaled, their skepticism towards requiring agency fees. No one, to my knowledge, has addressed the issue that I've raised in this book, which is one of the reasons why it's getting so much attention, because it's making people look at it in a different way, including the Supreme Court. So I can't predict what the Supreme Court would do, but from reading Janus and other opinions, you don't have to be too optimistic to realize that the Supreme Court is very skeptical of the power of the public employee union. So I think it's an attractive case to bring, and so we're talking with people, including the public interest law firm that did the Janus opinion, about bringing these cases.
All right. Well, I think that's a great way to leave it, but anything we didn't discuss relating to this issue that you would like to bring up at this time?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd like to say is that it's easy to get jaded by the failures of modern democracy. But what the public unions have done serves no public benefit. It is a scandal. It is a scandal that you can never fix a lousy school. It is a scandal that they prevent new charter schools. It is a scandal that the services cost twice as much as they should. Why should, I mean, liberals of all people are supposed to be for good government, and here they are for completely selfish political aims, supporting a group that guarantees bad government. So one of my goals is to make the harm that public unions have done to our country part of the 2024 presidential debates. And that requires citizens and thought leaders such as yourself to begin talking about this and saying, well, wait a minute, why should it work this way? What is the harm that's caused? And if we get people, if people sort of understand and get as angry as they should be at what's happened, then that will be a strong wind towards change, including change in the courts.
All right. The book is Not Accountable: Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. Phillip K. Howard is the author, and it does have a foreword from Mitch Daniels, former governor of Indiana, who was, one of I think the better governors we've had in recent American history. So somebody who definitely has been there, done that when it comes to some of these battles. So thank you very much. Where do people find out more about your organization, Common Good?
Oh, just go to commongood.org. And I'm hoping, we can work with the Rio Grande Institute and others. We're a small group, and we typically partner with other think tanks and organizations to do our reforms. We don't try to be independent. We have one kind of, point of view. We have pointed proposals like the one we have here, and then we work with other think tanks to try to make it happen.
All right. Appreciate your time again, and best of luck. And, we'll definitely have a follow-up conversation to see what tangible efforts we can help you undertake here in New Mexico. All right. We are going to leave things there. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path Remarketing for producing this show.